Rain hit the chapel windows like small stones thrown by an angry hand, and Eleanor Whitmore stood frozen at the altar with her heart pounding harder than the storm outside. The priest's voice droned on, asking if anyone objected to this union, and for one wild second she almost raised her own hand against herself. Beside her stood Gareth Ashford, tall and cold, his fingers gripping hers so tightly it hurt. She had learned to smile through pain. She had not learned how to stop her mind from drifting to a face she had tried for 3 years to forget. The chapel was full. Rows of powdered wigs and silk gloves, cousins and neighbors and men her father owed favors to, all watching her the way people watch a prize horse paraded before a race. Her father, Lord Edmund Whitmore, sat in the front pew with an expression of quiet triumph, as though he had won something rather than sold it. Eleanor's mother had died when she was 12, and since then her father had raised her the way a merchant raises stock, always thinking of value, never of feeling. She looked down at the ring Gareth was about to place on her finger, and felt nothing but a strange, cold distance, as if she were watching this happen to someone else. The candles flickered along the aisle, thunder rolled somewhere far off, low and threatening, and a gust of wind rattled the tall windows so hard that a woman in the third row gasped and clutched her shawl. Eleanor thought of the woods. She had not let herself think of them in a long time, not since the summer 3 years ago when everything had changed, when a man with quiet gray eyes and an easy laugh had waited for her beneath the old oak near the stream and told her things no one else had ever bothered to say. That he saw her, truly saw her, not as a name attached to a dowry, not as a duty to be managed, but as a person worth knowing. He had written to her every week that autumn. Then the letters stopped, and 2 months later her father announced her engagement to Gareth Ashford, a man 12 years her senior, with a reputation for cruelty he wore like a badge of honor. She had told herself the man from the woods simply lost interest. Men did that. She had built a wall around the memory brick by brick until she could walk past it without flinching. But standing here now, in this dress that felt more like a costume than a gown, she realized the wall had cracks in it, and every crack let in a little more light, a little more truth, until the whole structure threatened to collapse. The priest asked the final question, "Do you take this man?" Eleanor opened her mouth to say the word that would end her life as she knew it, and begin another one, smaller, colder, entirely controlled by someone else's hand. Nothing came out. The silence stretched long enough that people began to shift in their seats. Gareth's grip tightened further, his jaw setting into a hard line, a warning she recognized instantly, because she had seen it before, in private moments, when no one else was watching. She thought of the years ahead of her, entire decades, spent flinching at that same look across a dinner table, across a bedroom, across every room in a house that would never feel like home. Something in her broke open. She pulled her hand free. The gasp that rippled through the chapel sounded like a wave crashing against rock. Eleanor did not wait to explain herself. She gathered the heavy skirts of her wedding dress in both fists and turned, running down the long aisle past faces frozen in shock, past her father half rising from his seat with fury already reddening his face, past Gareth's furious shout that cracked through the air like a whip. She pushed through the great chapel doors and the storm swallowed her whole. Rain soaked through the silk in seconds, turning the dress heavy and cold against her skin, but she did not stop. She ran across the gravel drive, past the waiting carriages, past the startled coachman who called after her, and out toward the tree line that bordered the estate, the one place that had always felt more like sanctuary than any church ever had. Behind her she heard her father's voice roaring her name, heard the commotion of guests spilling out into the rain, heard Gareth ordering someone to fetch the horses. She did not look back. Looking back had never done her any good. The woods rose up dark and dripping ahead of her, branches heavy with rain, the path barely visible in the gray afternoon light. She had played here as a girl, had walked here as a young woman falling in love for the first and only time, and now she ran here as a woman fleeing the wreckage of a life she had never chosen for herself. Her slippers, thin and useless against the mud, slipped on wet stone. She caught herself against a tree trunk, gasping, her chest burning from the run, her whole body shaking from cold and fear, and something that felt almost like freedom, though freedom had never once in her life felt so much like terror. Thunder cracked overhead, closer now, and lightning split the sky in a flash of white that lit the woods for one bright second. In that second she saw movement ahead, a shape among the trees that did not belong to the storm. Her heart, already pounding, seized entirely. She told herself it was an animal, a deer startled by the thunder, nothing more. She told herself many things as she stood there soaked and trembling. But none of them stopped the cold certainty crawling up her spine that she was not alone in these woods, and that whoever waited among the dripping trees had been there before she arrived. She thought of turning back, of facing her father's fury and Gareth's cold rage rather than whatever waited ahead. But going back meant a lifetime sealed shut, a door closing forever on any chance of a different life. She had already run this far. She could not make herself turn around. She stepped forward, pushing wet branches from her face, her breath coming in short clouds in the cold air. The rain had not lessened. If anything, it fell harder now, drumming against the canopy above until the whole world seemed made of nothing but water and shadow. Another flash of lightning. Another glimpse of the shape ahead, closer this time, tall and still, watching her the way a man watches something he cannot quite believe he is seeing. Eleanor stopped walking. Every instinct told her to run, and yet something else, something older and quieter, told her to stay exactly where she was. The rain eased for one strange moment, as if the storm itself was holding its breath. A voice came from the shadows, low and familiar in a way that made her stomach drop straight through the earth. Eleanor. Her name, spoken in that voice, undid 3 years of careful forgetting in a single heartbeat. She had heard that voice in dreams she refused to admit having. She had heard it in the quiet moments before sleep when her defenses were too tired to hold. She had told herself she would never hear it again, that the man who owned it had walked away from her without a backward glance, that whatever they had shared beneath the old oak tree had meant nothing to him at all. And yet here he stood, in the middle of the same woods where it had all begun, as though the years between then and now had folded in on themselves and left no distance at all. Lightning flashed once more, and this time she saw his face clearly. Older than she remembered, sharper around the jaw, dressed in fine dark clothes that marked him as a man of considerable standing now, not the younger man in simple riding clothes she had once known. But the eyes were the same, gray and steady and fixed entirely on her. Alistair, she whispered, and the name felt strange on her tongue after so long unused, like a word from a language she had forced herself to forget. Neither of them moved. Rain fell between them, a curtain of silver in the gray light, and for one suspended moment the entire world narrowed down to the small space between two people who had once meant everything to each other and now stood as strangers wearing familiar faces. Somewhere behind her, faint through the trees, she heard her father's voice still calling her name, and the sound of horses being readied, men preparing to search the grounds. Time was already running short. Whatever this moment was, it would not last. Alistair took one slow step toward her, careful, the way a man approaches something he fears might vanish if startled. "You are soaked through," he said quietly, "and it is not safe out here alone, not in this weather, not with what is surely coming after you." She wanted to ask him 100 questions at once. Why he had stopped writing, why he was here, in these particular woods, on this particular day, as though fate itself had arranged the meeting. Whether he had married, whether he had thought of her at all in 3 long years, whether the thing between them had ever been real or only something she had imagined in her own loneliness. Instead, what came out was smaller, more honest than she intended. "I ran from my own wedding." Something shifted in his expression, surprise and something else she could not name flickering across his features before he composed himself again. "Then you had better come with me," he said, holding out a hand, "before they find you standing in the rain looking like you have seen a ghost." She looked at his outstretched hand, rain running down his fingers, and thought of everything waiting behind her in the chapel. The ruined dress, the ruined engagement, the ruined reputation she would carry from this day forward no matter what happened next. She thought too of everything that might be waiting ahead, uncertain and unknown, standing in the shape of a man she had once loved and never stopped, not really, not even when she told herself she had. The storm rolled on above them, indifferent to the choice she was about to make. His fingers closed around hers, warm despite the cold rain, and for a moment the years between them seemed to dissolve entirely. She remembered this same warmth from another time, another storm, when they had sheltered beneath the branches of the old oak and talked until the sky cleared and the stars came out one by one. She had believed then that nothing could ever separate them. She had been wrong, and the wrongness of it had shaped every choice she made afterward, every wall she built, every smile she forced at a dinner table across from a man she did not love. "Come," Alistair said, his voice low against the drumming rain. "There is a hunting lodge not far from here, on the old boundary line. It will keep you dry until we decide what is to be done." She let him lead her deeper into the trees, away from the sound of her father's men and the search that was surely already beginning in earnest. Branches caught at her ruined dress, tearing the delicate lace at the hem, but she found she did not care. The dress belonged to a life she had already left behind at the chapel door. They walked in silence for a while, the only sounds the rain and their own footsteps in the wet earth. Eleanor stole glances at him as they went, trying to reconcile the boy she remembered with the man walking beside her now, taller somehow, more certain of himself, carrying an authority in his bearing that had not been there 3 years ago. Whatever had happened to him in the time since they parted, it had changed him as surely as the years had changed her. She wondered what he saw when he looked at her. A runaway bride, soaked and shivering, hardly the composed young woman he might have remembered. And yet he had not hesitated to help her, had not asked why before offering shelter, and something in that quiet kindness settled a small, frightened part of her that had been bracing for judgment since the moment she fled the chapel. Ahead, through the rain, the dark shape of a stone lodge came into view, its windows dark, smoke rising faintly from a chimney that suggested someone kept it maintained even in his absence. Eleanor felt a fresh wave of nerves rise in her chest. Whatever waited inside that lodge, whatever conversation was about to unfold between them, would decide far more than where she spent the next hour sheltering from the storm. It would decide who she became next. Eleanor reached out and placed her hand in his. The lodge was small but warm, a single main room with a stone fireplace already glowing with embers, as though someone had lit it not long before. Alistair moved quickly, adding fresh wood until the flames caught and spread, throwing orange light across the wooden walls and the worn but comfortable furniture arranged near the hearth. Eleanor stood dripping just inside the door, suddenly aware of how strange this all was, how impossible it would have seemed only an hour ago that she would be standing in a hunting lodge with a man she had not seen in 3 years, wearing a ruined wedding dress, with half the county surely searching for her by now. "There is a room through there," Alistair said, gesturing toward a door at the back of the lodge, not quite meeting her eyes. "You will find dry clothes, though I confess they belong to my sister, and may not fit perfectly. It is better than staying in that." She glanced down at the sodden silk clinging to her, and heat rose in her cheeks despite the cold. She nodded and hurried toward the room he indicated, grateful for a moment alone to gather her scattered thoughts. The clothes were simple, a woolen dress in deep blue, plain but clean and blessedly dry. Eleanor changed quickly, her fingers clumsy with cold, and studied her reflection in a small cracked mirror hanging on the wall. Her hair had come loose from its careful arrangement, dark strands plastered to her face and neck, and her eyes looked wide and startled, like someone who had just woken from a long sleep into a world entirely unfamiliar. She thought of Gareth's face when she pulled her hand free. She thought of her father's roar echoing through the chapel. She thought of everything she had left behind, and everything still waiting to be faced, and for a moment, the weight of it all pressed down so heavily, she had to grip the edge of a small table to steady herself. When she returned to the main room, Alistair had set 2 cups near the fire and was watching the flames with an expression she could not quite read. He looked up when she entered, and something in his gaze softened, though his jaw remained tight, as though he were holding back a great deal he wished to say. "Sit," he said, gesturing to the chair opposite his own. "You are still shaking." She sat, accepting the cup he offered, warm liquid that tasted of honey and something stronger beneath it. For a while neither of them spoke, the silence filled only by the crackle of the fire and the steady drumming of rain against the roof. It was Eleanor who finally broke it. "Why are you here?" she asked quietly. "In these woods, today, of all days?" Alistair's jaw tightened further. "I am selling this land. My family's estate borders your father's, as you well remember. I came to finalize matters with the solicitor before returning south. I had no notion your wedding was happening today, if that is what you are asking." "I was not accusing you of anything," she said, though some part of her had wondered exactly that. Some small suspicious voice asking whether fate alone had brought them to the same patch of earth on the very day her life fell apart. "Weren't you?" he said, and there was an edge to his voice now, old hurt surfacing despite his obvious effort to remain calm. "You have every reason to think poorly of me, I suppose, though I confess I do not entirely understand why." Eleanor set her cup down harder than she intended. "You vanished. One autumn we were writing letters every week, and the next I heard nothing at all. Not a word, not an explanation. And then 2 months later my father announced my engagement, and I understood well enough what silence like that means from a man." Alistair stared at her as though she had struck him. "I wrote to you every week for 4 months after that autumn ended. I never once stopped, not until your own letters stopped coming, and I told myself you had simply moved on. that perhaps you had realized the difference in our stations mattered more than either of us wished to admit. The fire popped loudly in the silence that followed. That is not true, Eleanor said slowly, her mind racing backward through months she had spent grieving a silence she believed he had chosen. I never stopped writing. I waited every day for word from you, and when nothing came, I told myself you had grown tired of a girl who could offer you nothing of value. They stared at each other across the small space between their chairs, the fire crackling, rain still falling steadily outside, both of them turning over the same impossible puzzle. If neither of them had stopped writing, then where had all those letters gone? My father, Eleanor said slowly, the words feeling strange and heavy as they left her mouth, as though speaking them aloud might make an unbearable truth undeniably real. He handled all my correspondence that year. He said it was proper, given my age, that a young lady's letters ought to pass through her father's hands first. Alistair's expression shifted from confusion to something colder, something that looked dangerously close to fury barely held in check. And mine passed through no one. I sent them directly to your family's estate, addressed to you by name. Eleanor felt the floor seem to tilt beneath her, though she remained perfectly still in her chair. Her father, who had always claimed to want what was best for her, who had spoken of Gareth's engagement as though it were a gift rather than a transaction. Her father, who controlled every letter that came and went from their household during exactly the months when everything had fallen apart. He would not, she whispered, though even as she said it she knew the protest was hollow, knew in some deep unacknowledged part of herself that her father was entirely capable of such a thing, had perhaps always been capable of it, and she had simply refused to see it clearly until this exact moment. Wouldn't he? Alistair said quietly, watching her face with careful attention. A duke's younger son writing love letters to his daughter, at a time when a far more advantageous match had likely already been arranged behind the scenes. What father, ambitious as yours has always been known to be, would allow that correspondence to continue unimpeded? Eleanor pressed her fingers against her temples, trying to steady the spinning sensation building behind her eyes. 3 years. 3 years of believing herself abandoned, of building walls brick by brick around a heart she told herself had simply been mistaken about what it felt. 3 years of a quiet, private grief she had never spoken aloud to anyone, not even her closest friend Charlotte, because admitting the grief meant admitting how deeply she had allowed herself to hope. And all of it, perhaps, built on nothing but her father's careful manipulation. If that is true, she said, her voice barely above a whisper, then everything I believed about the past 3 years is wrong. Everything I told myself about why you left, why I had to accept Gareth, why there was no other choice available to me. All of it built on a lie my own father constructed. Alistair rose from his chair and crossed to the window, staring out at the rain-soaked woods beyond, his back rigid with barely contained anger. I confronted your father once, you know. Not long after the letters stopped. I rode to your estate and asked to see you directly, and he told me you had made your feelings clear, that you wished no further contact, that continuing to write would only cause you distress. Eleanor's stomach twisted. She remembered nothing of any such conversation, remembered only the slow, agonizing realization that Alistair had simply stopped, that whatever had existed between them had apparently meant less to him than it had to her. He never told me you came, she said. I never knew. Alistair turned back to face her, and the look in his eyes was unlike anything she had seen from him before, a mixture of fury and grief and something else she recognized because she felt it too, a fragile, dangerous hope that perhaps the years between them had been built on nothing more than one man's carefully constructed deception. 3 years, he said quietly. 3 years lost because your father decided we were not permitted to choose for ourselves. Outside, the storm showed no sign of easing. Somewhere beyond these woods, her father and the man she had nearly married were surely organizing search parties, preparing explanations for the scandal already spreading through the county like fire through dry grass. Eleanor knew she could not stay hidden in this lodge forever, knew the world outside would demand answers soon enough. But for this moment, sitting across the fire from a man she had spent 3 years believing had abandoned her, she found she could not bring herself to think of anything beyond the terrible, freeing possibility that everything she believed about her own life might have been a lie all along, and that the truth, however painful, might also hold the only real chance she had ever had at happiness. What do we do now? She asked quietly. Alistair returned to his chair, sitting close enough now that she could feel the warmth of him even without touching, and for the first time since she had fled the chapel, Eleanor felt something other than fear settle into her chest. Now, he said, we decide what you actually want, Eleanor, not what your father wants, Not what Gareth Ashford believes he is owed. For the first time in 3 years, you and I sit in a room together, with no one controlling what passes between us. I intend to make certain that remains true, whatever it costs either of us." Eleanor wrapped her hands around the cooling cup in her lap, watching the firelight play across Alistair's face, searching for some sign of the boy she remembered inside the man he had become. She found traces of him still, in the way his eyes crinkled slightly when he spoke, in the careful patience he showed even now, when anger would have been the easier, more expected response. "Tell me about these 3 years," she said. "Tell me what happened to you after." He was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire as though searching for the right place to begin. "My father died 18 months ago. The title passed to me sooner than anyone expected, and with it came debts I did not know existed, obligations I had never been trained to manage. I spent most of the past year simply trying to keep the estate from collapsing entirely. I am sorry," she said, and meant it, though the words felt inadequate against the weight of what he described. "I do not tell you this for sympathy," Alistair said, glancing up at her. "I tell you because I want you to understand why I never returned to press the matter further, why I let 3 years pass without seeking you out again. I believed you had rejected me. I had no wish to humiliate myself further by insisting otherwise. And then my father's death consumed every waking hour I had. There was no room left for old grief, or so I told myself." Eleanor understood that kind of grief, the sort that demanded to be pushed down and buried beneath duty and obligation, because there was simply no space to feel it properly. She had done the same thing herself, filling her days with the endless small tasks her father assigned her, embroidery and correspondence and the management of household accounts, anything that kept her hands and mind too occupied to dwell on what she had lost. "I did the same," she admitted. "I told myself that if I stayed busy enough, the ache would eventually fade. It never did. It simply grew quieter, until I nearly forgot I was carrying it at all." Outside, a sound cut through the rain, distant but unmistakable, the bark of hounds, and the shout of men calling to one another across the fields. Eleanor's whole body went rigid. Alistair rose immediately, moving to the window and peering out through the rain-streaked glass. "They are searching the northern fields," he said. "It will not be long before someone thinks to check these woods as well." Eleanor stood, her heart hammering with fresh urgency. "If they find me here, with you, it will only make things worse. My father will say you seduced me away from my wedding, that you orchestrated the entire scandal to ruin Gareth's reputation, and claim me for yourself." "Would that be so far from the truth of what I want?" Alistair said quietly, turning back to face her, and the directness of the question stole the breath from her lungs entirely. She did not answer immediately, because she did not trust herself to speak without revealing exactly how much his words had affected her. Instead, she moved toward the window herself, watching the distant shapes of men and horses moving along the tree line, close enough now that she could make out individual voices carried on the wind. "We cannot stay here," she said, "but I am not ready to go back either, not yet. Not until I understand what any of this means, what I actually want instead of what has always been decided for me." Alistair studied her for a long moment, something resolving behind his gray eyes. "There is another path through these woods, one that leads to a small village a few miles east. My carriage is there, waiting for my return to the city. If you wish it, I can take you somewhere safe, somewhere you can think clearly without your father's voice shouting in your ear, or Gareth's men dragging you back to a church you already refused once." The offer hung between them, enormous and terrifying and more tempting than she wanted to admit. Everything in her upbringing told her to return, to accept whatever punishment her father devised, to marry Gareth quietly in some smaller ceremony and let the scandal fade as best it could. Everything in her heart told her that returning meant surrendering the only real choice she had ever been given in her entire life. The hounds barked again, closer this time. "Yes," she said, before she could talk herself out of it. "Take me somewhere I can breathe." Alistair moved quickly then, gathering a heavy cloak from a hook near the door and settling it around her shoulders, his hands lingering a moment longer than necessary at her collarbone before he stepped back, as though reminding himself of some boundary he did not wish to cross without her clear invitation. "Stay close," he said, "and stay quiet. The path is narrow, but it will keep us hidden from the search until we reach the village." They slipped out the back of the lodge into the rain, the storm finally beginning to soften into a steady drizzle, and Eleanor followed him through the dense trees, her borrowed dress catching on branches, her heart pounding with a mixture of terror and something dangerously close to exhilaration. For the first time since she could remember, she was choosing her own path forward, however uncertain it might be, and whatever waited for her at the end of it, she intended to face it with her eyes fully open. Rain continued to fall against the leaves above them, but inside her chest, something had shifted, some old wound finally beginning, however painfully, to heal. The village of Ashcombe sat quiet beneath the drizzle, its narrow streets nearly empty as Eleanor and Alistair made their way toward the inn where his carriage waited. She kept the borrowed cloak pulled tight around her face, grateful for the hood that hid her features from any passing stranger who might recognize the daughter of Lord Whitmore wandering the streets in stolen clothes, hours after fleeing her own wedding. The carriage was plain but sturdy, the horses already harnessed and waiting under the watchful eye of a driver who did not so much as blink at the sight of his employer arriving with a soaked, disheveled young woman at his side. Alistair helped her inside, settling across from her as the carriage lurched forward, wheels splashing through puddles that had gathered along the village road. "Where are we going?" Eleanor asked, watching the last buildings of Ashcombe disappear behind them into the gray afternoon. "My townhouse, in the city," Alistair said. "It is not grand, not by the standards you likely grew up with, but it is private, and my staff can be trusted to keep silent about whatever they observe. You will be safe there while we decide what comes next." She nodded, though a fresh wave of nerves rose in her chest at the thought of what came next. She had run from her wedding with nothing but the clothes on her back, and even those now belonged to a stranger's sister. She had no money of her own, no home to return to that would not also mean a return to her father's control, no plan beyond the desperate impulse that had carried her through the chapel doors and into the rain. "I have nothing," she said quietly, the admission costing her more than she expected. "No money, no belongings, nothing but the scandal I have created for myself. My father will disown me for this, and Gareth will make certain every family of consequence hears exactly how I humiliated him in front of half the county." Alistair leaned forward slightly, his gray eyes steady on hers. "You have more than you think, Eleanor. You have your own mind, your own will, and now the truth about what actually happened 3 years ago. That is worth more than any dowry your father might have offered as leverage over you." She wanted to believe him, wanted to let his certainty settle the storm of anxiety still churning inside her. But years of careful training told her that the world rarely rewarded a woman for choosing herself over the expectations placed upon her. She had seen other women who defied their families, watched them become cautionary tales whispered about at dinner parties, their names attached forever to scandal and ruin. "You do not know what it means to lose everything," she said. "You are a duke. Whatever happens, you will always have your title, your estate, your place in society. If I do this, if I truly do this, I lose all of it, my family, my reputation, any chance at a respectable life." Something flickered across Alistair's face, a flash of old hurt quickly masked. "I know more about losing everything than you might imagine. When my father died, I inherited a title buried so deep in debt that for months I did not know if I would keep the estate at all. I have spent the past year rebuilding what should have been secure from the start, learning every day that titles and names mean far less than people believe, that security can vanish as quickly as a bad harvest or a foolish investment." Eleanor studied him in the dim carriage light, seeing for the first time not simply the boy she remembered or the powerful duke he had become, but a man who had weathered his own private storms while she believed him living comfortably, untouched by the same grief that had shaped her. "I am sorry," she said again, and this time the words carried more weight, more genuine understanding. "I did not know." "How could you?" he said. "We were both taught to carry our burdens silently, to present a composed face to the world regardless of what churned beneath it. It is perhaps the one lesson our family succeeded in teaching us both." The carriage rolled on through the darkening afternoon, rain still falling steadily against the windows, and Eleanor found herself studying the passing countryside with a strange, unfamiliar sense of possibility. Everything she passed now belonged to a future she had not chosen for herself, uncertain and frightening, and entirely her own. They arrived at the townhouse as evening settled fully over the city, gas lamps flickering to life along the quiet street where Alistair's residence stood, elegant but understated among its grander neighbors. A housekeeper, an older woman with kind eyes and a manner that suggested nothing surprised her anymore, greeted them at the door without a single question about Eleanor's disheveled appearance or the unusual circumstances of her arrival. "Mrs. Bellwether will see you settled," Alistair said, gesturing toward the older woman. "I have matters to attend to this evening, but we will speak further in the morning, once you have rested." Eleanor nodded, suddenly exhausted in a way that went beyond the physical strain of the day's events, a deep weariness that settled into her bones as the adrenaline of her escape finally began to fade. Mrs. Bellwether led her upstairs to a modest but comfortable room, provided fresh clothing that fit far better than the borrowed dress she still wore, and left her alone with a promise of a hot meal sent up shortly. Alone for the first time since fleeing the chapel, Eleanor sat on the edge of the unfamiliar bed and allowed herself finally to cry. She wept for the 3 years she had spent believing herself abandoned, for the quiet grief she had carried alone without ever speaking its true name aloud. She wept for her father's betrayal, for the careful, calculated manipulation that had shaped the entire course of her adult life without her ever suspecting the truth. She wept for the wedding she had fled, for the scandal that would surely follow her name for years to come, and for the terrifying uncertainty of whatever came next. But beneath the grief, something else stirred as well, something that felt dangerously close to hope, and when the tears finally slowed, Eleanor found herself thinking not of everything she had lost, but of everything that might still be possible. The following morning brought a knock at her door earlier than she expected. Mrs. Bellwether entered with a tray of tea and toast, along with a folded newspaper tucked beneath her arm, her expression carefully neutral, in a way that immediately put Eleanor on alert. "His Grace thought you should see this," the housekeeper said, setting the newspaper on the small table beside the bed, before departing with a discretion that suggested long practice at delivering difficult news. Eleanor unfolded the paper with trembling hands and found her own scandal splashed across the society pages, her name printed alongside speculation about her whereabouts and increasingly wild theories about what had driven her from the altar. One account suggested she had been seen fleeing with a mysterious gentleman into the countryside. Another claimed her father had offered a substantial reward for information leading to her safe return. A third, more cruel than the others, suggested that Gareth Ashford had been fortunate to escape a bride so clearly unstable and unfit for proper society. She set the paper down, her hands shaking, and found Alistair standing in her doorway, having apparently arrived sometime during her reading without her noticing. "It will only grow worse before it grows better," he said quietly, entering the room and taking a seat in the chair near her bed. "Your father has considerable influence, and Gareth Ashford will not accept public humiliation quietly. We should expect them to pursue you, both for the sake of appearances and because your father's plans clearly depended on this marriage proceeding as arranged." "What plans?" Eleanor asked, though some instinct told her she already suspected the answer. Alistair's expression turned grim. "I made some inquiries last night, after you retired. Gareth Ashford has been in significant debt for some time, debt that your father's dowry would have substantially relieved. There are also rumors, unconfirmed but persistent, that your father himself owes considerable sums to Ashford's family, debts that this marriage was meant to settle through more informal arrangements between the two men." Eleanor felt something cold settle in her stomach. "You are saying my father sold me to pay his own debts and dressed it up as a respectable match?" "I am saying it is worth considering," Alistair said carefully. "Nothing is confirmed, but it would explain the urgency with which your engagement was arranged, and why your father intercepted our correspondence so thoroughly 3 years ago. A duke's younger son offered no immediate financial relief. Gareth Ashford, tied through his own family's connections, apparently did." The pieces of her life rearranged themselves in Eleanor's mind, forming a picture far more calculated and cruel than she had ever allowed herself to imagine about her own father. She had spent years believing his coldness toward her was simply his nature, an unfortunate but unavoidable consequence of raising a daughter alone after her mother's death. She had never considered that his coldness might be strategy, that every decision regarding her future might have been weighed not for her benefit but for his own. "I need to know for certain," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I cannot simply hide here, wondering, while my father spins whatever story serves him best to the rest of society. I need proof, or at the very least, I need to confront him directly and see what truth I can extract from his own mouth." Alistair studied her for a long moment, something like respect flickering behind his gray eyes. "That is a dangerous path, Eleanor. If you return to confront him, even briefly, there is a real risk he will not let you leave again. Men like your father do not surrender control easily, especially not when that control has already been publicly challenged." "I know the risk," she said, "but I have spent my entire life letting other people decide what happens to me. First my father, then Gareth, and even, in some ways, you 3 years ago, when I simply accepted your silence as the end of everything, without ever demanding an explanation. I will not spend the rest of my life the same way. If I am to build something new, something honest, I need to face what came before it directly, not hide from it in a stranger's guest room, however kind that stranger has been." Something shifted in Alistair's expression, a mixture of concern and undeniable admiration. "Then I will not let you face it alone. Whatever happens when you confront your father, I intend to stand beside you through it, publicly and without hesitation. I have spent 3 years regretting that I did not fight harder for you the first time. I do not intend to make that same mistake twice." Eleanor felt something warm and fragile bloom in her chest, a feeling she had almost forgotten how to recognize after years of careful emotional distance. It was not simply relief, though relief was certainly part of it. It was something closer to being truly seen, truly chosen, in a way she had convinced herself she would never experience again after that autumn 3 years ago when the letters had stopped and her heart had quietly closed itself off from further hope. "Thank you," she said softly. "Do not thank me yet," Alistair replied, though a small, genuine smile finally broke through his careful composure. "Your father is not a man who surrenders easily, and Gareth Ashford will not accept his humiliation without seeking some form of retribution. Whatever confrontation lies ahead of us will not be simple, and it will not be without cost." Outside the window, the city continued its morning routine, entirely indifferent to the storm of scandal and revelation unfolding within the quiet townhouse. Eleanor looked out at the gray sky, still heavy with the promise of more rain, and felt a strange calm settle over her despite everything still uncertain ahead. Later that morning, a visitor arrived at the townhouse whose presence Eleanor had not anticipated. Mrs. Bellwether announced her with careful discretion, and when the door opened, Eleanor found herself face to face with Charlotte Pemberton, her closest friend since childhood, standing in the doorway with an expression caught somewhere between relief and exasperation. "You could have sent word," Charlotte said, crossing the room in a rush of skirts to embrace her tightly. "I have spent the entire night imagining the worst, that you had been dragged back to that wedding by force, or worse, that something terrible had happened to you out in that storm." "How did you know to find me here?" Eleanor asked, pulling back to study her friend's face. Charlotte's expression turned wry. "The entire city knows by now, Eleanor. Your disappearance is the only topic anyone discusses at breakfast tables from here to the coast. I simply used my own judgment about where a certain duke might have taken a runaway bride, given the history between the two of you that you never quite managed to hide from me, however hard you tried." Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks, though she could not summon any real embarrassment given everything else occupying her thoughts. "You knew about Alistair, about what happened 3 years ago." "I suspected," Charlotte said, settling into the chair near the window. "You were never quite the same after that autumn. I assumed some quiet heartbreak I was not permitted to know the details of, and I respected your silence, though it worried me more than I ever admitted." Eleanor found herself recounting the previous day's events, the wedding, the flight into the storm, the discovery in the woods, the devastating revelation about her father's interference in their correspondence. Charlotte listened without interruption, her expression shifting from shock to fury, as the full scope of Lord Whitmore's manipulation became clear. "I always thought your father cold," Charlotte said when Eleanor finished, "but I never imagined him capable of something so deliberately cruel. To intercept letters between two people who cared for each other, simply to arrange a match that served his own financial interests. It is unconscionable." "I intend to confront him," Eleanor said, "today, if possible. I cannot continue hiding here while he tells whatever story he wishes to the rest of society." Charlotte's expression grew serious. "Then you should not go alone, and you certainly should not go without a plan. Your father is not a man who responds well to being cornered, and if what you suspect about his debts to the Ashford family is true, he has every incentive to control the narrative however he can, even if that means further harming you in the process. Alistair has already offered to accompany me," Eleanor said. "Good," Charlotte replied firmly, "but you will need more than his presence alone. You will need proof, Eleanor, something beyond your own testimony, that your father cannot simply dismiss as the fevered imagination of a hysterical daughter, which is precisely how he will attempt to frame this entire situation to anyone who will listen." The observation struck Eleanor with uncomfortable clarity. She had been so consumed by the emotional weight of the revelation, by the grief of 3 lost years and the fragile hope of what might still be possible with Alistair, that she had not fully considered the practical reality of what confronting her father would actually require. Accusations alone, however true, would mean little against a man skilled at controlling perception and narrative among their social circle. "What kind of proof could I possibly find?" she asked. "He would have destroyed any letters long ago, if he kept them at all, rather than burning them immediately." Charlotte considered this for a moment, her expression thoughtful. "Servants remember more than families like to believe, Eleanor. Someone in your father's household during that autumn 3 years ago may recall the correspondence, may have been the one instructed to intercept it in the first place." Your father is not a man who handles such details personally. He would have relied on someone else to do the actual work of destroying those letters. The suggestion sparked something in Eleanor, a path forward that felt more solid than simply walking into her father's study and demanding answers he could easily deny. Mrs. Fenwick, she said slowly, remembering the household's longtime housekeeper, a woman who had served her family since before Eleanor's own birth, and who had always shown her quiet, if reserved, kindness. If anyone in that household knows the truth, it would be her. Then perhaps, Charlotte said, your confrontation with your father should not be your first stop. Perhaps you should speak with Mrs. Fenwick directly, discreetly, before you ever set foot in your father's study, so that when you do confront him, you carry more than accusations. You carry certainty he cannot simply talk his way around. Eleanor felt a fresh surge of resolve replace the anxious uncertainty that had gripped her since waking. Charlotte's practical mind, always sharper about strategy than Eleanor's own more emotional instincts, had given her exactly the plan she needed, a way forward that felt less like desperate confrontation and more like the careful, deliberate reclaiming of her own story. "Will you help me arrange it?" Eleanor asked. "A way to speak with Mrs. Fenwick without my father's knowledge, before he realizes I intend to return to the estate at all." Charlotte's smile turned determined. "Of course I will help you. What are friends for, if not helping each other burn down the lies our families have built around us?" She paused, then added more gently, "And for what it is worth, Eleanor, I am glad you ran. Whatever difficulties lie ahead, I have not seen you look this alive in years." Eleanor found herself smiling, despite everything still uncertain, a genuine smile that reached all the way to her tired eyes. For the first time in 3 years, she was no longer running from the truth. She was walking directly toward it, and whatever waited on the other side, she intended to meet it with her eyes open, and her own voice, finally, fully her own. Mrs. Fenwick agreed to meet Eleanor at a small tea house on the edge of the village nearest the Whitmore estate, a location chosen carefully by Charlotte to avoid any chance of the meeting reaching Lord Whitmore's attention before Eleanor was ready to face him. The old housekeeper arrived precisely on time, her expression guarded, glancing repeatedly toward the door, as though half expecting someone to burst in and demand an explanation for her presence there. "I should not be here," Mrs. Fenwick said, settling into the chair across from Eleanor, with visible reluctance. "Your father would have my position if he learned of this meeting, after everything else that has happened these past 2 days. I understand the risk you are taking," Eleanor said gently, "and I would not ask this of you if I had any other way to learn the truth. I need to know about the letters, Mrs. Fenwick, the ones exchanged between myself and Alistair Kingsley, 3 years ago." Something shifted in the older woman's face, a flicker of old guilt breaking through her careful composure. "I wondered when this day would come," she said quietly. "I have carried that particular weight for 3 years, wondering whether I did right by staying silent, or whether my silence made me as culpable as your father, in whatever pain it caused you." Eleanor's heart pounded. "Then it is true. He intercepted them." Mrs. Fenwick nodded slowly. "Your father instructed me directly, that autumn, to bring him any correspondence addressed to you before it reached your hands, and any letters you wished to send before they left the house. He told me it was a matter of protecting your reputation, ensuring no impropriety occurred between yourself and a young man not yet formally approved as a suitor. I believed him, at first. I did not realize the full extent of what he intended until it was already well underway." "What did he do with them?" Eleanor asked, though some part of her already dreaded the answer. "He read every letter that came from the young Duke," Mrs. Fenwick said. "And every letter you wrote in return, before deciding whether it would be sent at all. Most of yours he allowed through, in the beginning, though I believe he altered some of them, softening certain sentiments or removing passages he found too forward for his liking. But the letters coming to you from him, he destroyed nearly all of them, keeping only enough to maintain the appearance that correspondence was still occurring, should anyone think to ask." Eleanor felt the room tilt slightly around her, the full scope of her father's deception settling into her chest like a physical weight. Not simply intercepted correspondence, but carefully manipulated communication, edited and controlled to serve whatever purpose he had already decided upon before either she or Alistair fully understood what was happening to them. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely steady. "Why would he go to such lengths, rather than simply forbidding the match outright if he objected to it?" Mrs. Fenwick's expression turned pained. "Because forbidding it outright would have required explanation, and your father is not a man who enjoys explaining his decisions, particularly not to a daughter he expected to obey without question. It was simpler, in his mind, to let the connection wither on its own, to make you believe the young Duke had lost interest, rather than admit he was actively working to prevent a match he considered less advantageous than the one he had already begun arranging with the Ashford family. "You knew about the arrangement with Gareth," Eleanor said. "Even then." "I suspected," Mrs. Fenwick admitted. "There were visits from men handling your father's finances, quiet conversations behind closed doors, references to debts that needed settling through means beyond simple repayment. I did not know the full details, and it was not my place to ask. But I understood enough to know that whatever match your father intended for you, it was decided upon financial necessity rather than any genuine concern for your happiness." Eleanor sat in silence for a long moment, absorbing the full weight of what she had just learned. 3 years of grief, of believing herself unworthy of love, of quietly accepting a marriage to a man she did not love because she believed no better alternative remained available to her. All of it built upon her father's calculated manipulation of two young people's genuine affection for one another. "Would you be willing to say this?" Eleanor asked carefully. "If I needed you to, not simply to me, privately, but to others, should the situation require it." Mrs. Fenwick's hands tightened around her teacup, visible tension in her posture. "Your father would dismiss me without reference, without any means of supporting myself, should I speak against him publicly. I have served your family for 30 years, Eleanor. I have very little else beyond this position. No family of my own to fall back upon should I lose it." Eleanor understood the impossible position she was asking Mrs. Fenwick to consider. The very real cost the older woman would bear for telling a truth that Eleanor desperately needed exposed. She thought of Alistair's warning, that confronting her father would come with consequences beyond her own reputation, and felt a fresh wave of guilt for having asked Mrs. Fenwick to bear part of that cost on her behalf. "I would not ask you to risk your position without ensuring you were protected," Eleanor said slowly, an idea forming even as she spoke. "If you were willing to speak the truth, I would see to it personally that you never wanted for a position again. Alistair's household requires staff he can trust completely. I believe he would welcome someone of your experience and discretion, should you find yourself needing new employment as a result of speaking honestly about what you witnessed." Mrs. Fenwick studied her for a long moment, something shifting behind her careful, guarded expression. "You have grown considerably bolder than the girl I remember from 3 years ago," she said finally. "Perhaps running from that chapel did more good than harm, whatever the rest of society believes about the matter. Will you help me?" Eleanor asked again, more directly this time. The older woman was quiet for a long moment, staring down into her tea as though searching for an answer in its depths. When she finally looked up, something resolute had settled into her expression, the guarded uncertainty replaced by quiet determination. "I carried this guilt for 3 years, watching you grow quieter and more distant, knowing I held knowledge that might have changed everything, and saying nothing, because I feared for my own position more than I cared about your happiness. I am tired of carrying that particular weight, Eleanor. Yes, I will tell the truth, whatever it costs me, because you deserve better than the lie your father built around you." Relief flooded through Eleanor, sharp and overwhelming, followed quickly by a fierce gratitude toward the woman who had, despite every reason for self-preservation, chosen honesty over safety. She reached across the small table and took Mrs. Fenwick's hand, squeezing it gently. "Thank you," she said. "Truly. Whatever happens next, I will not forget what this cost you to say." They spoke for a while longer, Mrs. Fenwick providing additional details, the names of tradesmen who had delivered correspondence during that fateful autumn, specific dates and instances she remembered clearly enough to lend credibility to her account. Eleanor listened carefully, committing every detail to memory, building the foundation of truth she would need when she finally faced her father directly. When they parted ways outside the tea house, rain beginning to fall once more in a light, steady drizzle, Eleanor felt a strange mixture of grief and resolve settling into her chest. Grief for the years already lost, for the pain her father had caused through calculated deception, but resolve too, a clear sense of purpose that had been entirely absent from her life until the moment she chose to run from that altar. She returned to Alistair's townhouse to find him waiting anxiously near the entrance, having clearly worried through her extended absence. His relief at seeing her safe was evident despite his effort to maintain composure, and when she recounted everything Mrs. Fenwick had confirmed, his expression darkened with fresh anger on her behalf. "Then we have what we need," he said, once she finished. "Testimony from a servant who witnessed the manipulation directly, combined with our own accounts of letters that never arrived. It will not be pleasant, confronting your father with this, but it will be difficult for him to simply dismiss as fabrication." "There is something else," Eleanor said, a new thought occurring to her as she spoke. "If my father truly owes debts to the Ashford family, debts this marriage was meant to settle, There may be documentation of that arrangement as well. Financial records, correspondence between the two men discussing terms. If we could find proof of that alongside Mrs. Fenwick's account, it would leave him no room at all to claim this was simply a father's misguided concern for his daughter's well-being. Alistair's expression turned thoughtful. I have some connections who might help uncover such records discreetly. It will take time, perhaps a few days, but if such an arrangement exists in any formal capacity, we should be able to find evidence of it. Then we wait, Eleanor said, though patience felt like the hardest thing she had been asked to summon since fleeing the chapel 2 days before. We gather everything we can, and when we finally confront him, he will have no lies left convincing enough to hide behind. Outside, the rain continued its steady rhythm against the windows, and Eleanor found herself thinking not of the wedding she had fled, nor even of the uncertain future still stretching ahead of her, but of the strange, unexpected strength she had discovered within herself these past 2 days. She had spent her entire life believing herself powerless against her father's will, a pawn moved according to his calculations rather than her own desires. That belief, she realized now, had been as much a lie as everything else he had constructed around her. She was not powerless. She had simply never before been given the chance, or claimed the courage, to prove otherwise. 3 days passed before Alistair's connections returned with news. Eleanor spent the time restlessly, torn between gratitude for the safety of the townhouse and a growing impatience to finally confront the truth head-on. Charlotte visited twice more, bringing news of the gossip still circulating through the city, most of it unkind, some of it wildly inaccurate, all of it a reminder that whatever came next would unfold under the watchful eyes of a society eager for scandal. On the third evening, Alistair returned from a meeting with his solicitor carrying a leather folder, his expression a careful mixture of triumph and barely restrained anger. He found Eleanor in the small sitting room where she had taken to spending her afternoons and set the folder on the table before her without a word. "What is this?" she asked, though something in his manner told her already that it held the answers she had been waiting for. "Financial records," Alistair said, sitting across from her. "My solicitor has connections within several banking houses in the city, men who owe him favors from past dealings. It took some persuasion and no small amount of discretion, but he was able to confirm the existence of a private arrangement between your father and Gareth Ashford, dated some 4 years past, well before your engagement was ever formally announced." Eleanor opened the folder with trembling hands, scanning the documents inside. Columns of figures and formal language she did not fully understand, but recognized well enough in its essential meaning. Her father owed a substantial sum to Gareth Ashford's family, a debt incurred through some failed investment scheme that had nearly ruined the Whitmore estate entirely. "The marriage was the repayment," she said slowly, the pieces finally settling into a complete and devastating picture, not simply an advantageous match he preferred over a duke's younger son, an actual transaction, structured to erase a debt he could not otherwise repay. "It appears so," Alistair confirmed. "The document does not state it in such plain terms, of course. These arrangements rarely do. But the timeline is damning enough on its own. The debt was incurred, and within a year, your engagement to Gareth Ashford was formally announced, with terms that conveniently absolved your father of the outstanding sum." Eleanor set the papers down, her hands still trembling, though whether from anger or a strange, vindicated grief she could not entirely say. Every suspicion Charlotte had raised, every quiet fear Eleanor herself had refused to fully acknowledge, now confirmed in cold, official language she could not dismiss as her own overactive imagination. "He sold me," she said quietly, not metaphorically, not simply in the sense that all such marriages carry some transactional element. He sold me directly, to erase his own financial failure, and dress the entire arrangement up as a respectable match befitting my station. Alistair reached across the small space between them and took her hand, his grip firm and steady. "You are not defined by what he did to you, Eleanor. You are defined by what you choose to do now that you know the truth, and I believe you already know what that choice must be." Eleanor looked down at their joined hands, then up at the folder of damning evidence spread across the table before her, evidence that would soon force her father to face, in front of witnesses if necessary, the full consequence of his own deception. "I need to see him," she said. "Not simply write to him or send word through intermediaries. I need to stand in front of him and watch his face as I lay out everything I now know, everything he believed he had successfully hidden from me forever. Then we will arrange it," Alistair said. "Tomorrow, if you are ready. I will accompany you, and Charlotte as well if you wish it. along with whatever documentation we need to ensure he cannot simply talk his way past the truth as he has clearly done so many times before. Eleanor nodded slowly, a fresh resolve settling over the last of her lingering fear. Tomorrow, she would finally face the man who had shaped so much of her life through calculated deception. And for the first time since childhood, she would face him not as a daughter seeking approval, but as a woman who already knew, with complete and unshakable certainty, exactly what she deserved. The Whitmore estate looked exactly as Eleanor remembered it, grand stone walls and manicured gardens that had always felt more like a display of wealth than an actual home. She had not set foot on the ground since fleeing the chapel 5 days earlier, and approaching the front entrance now, flanked by Alistair on one side and Charlotte on the other, felt like walking into a battle she had spent her entire life avoiding. A footman answered the door, his eyes widening in visible shock at the sight of Eleanor standing on the threshold, alive and composed, when the household had spent nearly a week fearing the worst about her disappearance. "Lady Eleanor," he stammered. "Your father, he has been searching everywhere. The entire county has been in an uproar since." "I am aware," Eleanor said calmly, stepping past him into the entrance hall she had known her entire life. "Please inform my father that I wish to speak with him immediately, in his study, if he is available." The footman hurried away, and within minutes, Lord Whitmore appeared at the top of the grand staircase, his face cycling rapidly through shock, relief, and finally a hardening anger, as he took in the sight of his daughter standing beside the very man he had spent 3 years working to keep away from her. "Eleanor," he said, descending the stairs with measured steps that did little to hide the fury simmering beneath his composed exterior, "you have caused considerable damage to this family's reputation, disappearing without a word for 5 days. I trust you have come to your senses and intend to apologize properly to Gareth Ashford, whose patience I am certain has limits even you cannot afford to test." "I have not come to apologize," Eleanor said, her voice steadier than she felt, though years of practice at maintaining composure in her father's presence served her well in this moment. "I have come to discuss the truth, Father, about what actually happened 3 years ago, and about the actual reasons behind my engagement to Gareth Ashford." Something flickered across her father's face, a brief flash of alarm quickly smoothed over by practiced control. "I do not know what nonsense the Duke has filled your head with," he said, glancing pointedly at Alistair, "but I suggest you consider carefully whose word carries more weight in society. Mine, or a man clearly attempting to seduce you away from a respectable match for his own selfish purposes?" "It is not nonsense he filled my head with," Eleanor said. "It is truth I uncovered myself, with the help of people brave enough to finally speak honestly. After years of silence you enforced through fear and manipulation." Her father's expression hardened further. "Perhaps we should continue this conversation privately, Eleanor, rather than airing family matters in front of guests who have no true stake in this discussion." "They have every stake in this discussion," Eleanor replied firmly. "Alistair Kingsley has as much right to hear this truth as I do, given that his own letters to me were the ones you intercepted and destroyed. And Charlotte is here because she is the only person who has never once tried to control my choices for her own benefit, unlike everyone else in this household." Lord Whitmore's face reddened, anger finally breaking through his carefully maintained composure. "You dare accuse me of such a thing, in my own home, in front of witnesses. I raised you alone after your mother's death, sacrificed considerably to ensure your future was secure, and this is the gratitude you show me." "Sacrificed my future to secure your own debts, you mean?" Eleanor said, and watched with grim satisfaction as her father's face went pale beneath his anger. "I know about the arrangement with the Ashford family, Father. I have seen the financial records, the debt you owed them, the timeline that led directly to my engagement being announced within a year of that debt coming due. Would you like to explain that to me now, or shall we discuss it in front of the magistrate instead, along with the servant testimony confirming that you personally instructed the interception of correspondence between myself and Alistair, for the express purpose of ensuring our connection withered before it could interfere with your financial arrangements?" The silence that followed stretched long and heavy, her father's face cycling through several expressions before finally settling into something closer to cold calculation than the outraged denial Eleanor had half expected. "Whatever I did," Lord Whitmore said finally, his voice low and controlled in a way that felt more dangerous than his earlier anger, "I did to secure this family's future, including yours. Do you have any notion what would have become of us, of you, if I had allowed that debt to remain unpaid? We would have lost this estate entirely, Eleanor. You would have found yourself with no dowry, no prospects, no future at all beyond whatever charity distant relations might have offered a penniless young woman with no title to recommend her." "So you decided my future for me," Eleanor said, without ever once considering that I might have preferred honesty over security, that I might have chosen a smaller, humbler life built on truth rather than a grand one built on lies and manipulation. You are young, her father said dismissively. You do not understand yet what true security means, what it costs to maintain a family standing across generations. Someday you would have thanked me for the choices I made on your behalf. I would never have thanked you, Eleanor said, her voice rising for the first time. I spent 3 years grieving a love I believed had simply abandoned me. 3 years believing myself unworthy of genuine affection, all because you decided my happiness mattered less than settling your own financial mistakes. That is not a sacrifice made for my benefit, Father. That is a betrayal dressed up as parental concern. Lord Whitmore's gaze shifted to Alistair, who had remained silent throughout the exchange, his expression carefully neutral despite the visible tension in his shoulders. And you, Your Grace. I suppose you have come to claim what you believe is rightfully yours, now that the truth has finally surfaced. How convenient that a duke's fortune has apparently recovered enough to make my daughter worth pursuing again. I am not here to claim anything, Alistair said, his voice calm but carrying an unmistakable edge. I am here because Eleanor asked me to stand beside her while she confronted a truth you spent 3 years working to keep hidden. Whatever happens between us moving forward will be decided by her choice alone, not by any calculation of fortune or advantage on my part. Lord Whitmore's laugh held no genuine humor. How noble. Tell me, Your Grace, when this romantic notion of yours proves insufficient against the practical realities of maintaining an estate, when Eleanor discovers that love alone does not pay servants or maintain properties, or secure a family standing across generations, will you still speak so nobly of choice and honesty? I have managed my own estate through considerable difficulty this past year, Alistair replied evenly, without resorting to manipulation, deception, or the sacrifice of another person's happiness to solve my own financial failures. I do not require lessons from you on what practical realities demand, my lord. Charlotte, who had remained silent thus far, finally spoke, her voice cutting cleanly through the tense atmosphere. Perhaps, Lord Whitmore, you should consider how this conversation will appear to the rest of society, should Eleanor choose to make it public. A father who sold his daughter's future to settle his own debts, who intercepted private correspondence for years to manipulate her choices, who lied to both his own daughter and a duke's son to ensure his financial arrangement proceeded unimpeded. I imagine that story would spread through drawing rooms considerably faster than whatever narrative you have been constructing about Eleanor's supposed instability. The threat, delivered in Charlotte's calm, matter-of-fact tone, seemed to land harder than any of Eleanor's own angrier accusations. Lord Whitmore's face paled further, calculation visibly working behind his eyes as he weighed the consequences of exposure against whatever remaining leverage he believed he still held. What is it you want? He said finally, his voice tight with barely controlled fury. Money. A settlement to disappear quietly and let this scandal fade without further complication. Name your price, Eleanor, and let us conclude this unpleasant business. The offer, so casually transactional even now, confirmed everything Eleanor had come to understand about her father's true nature. Even faced with the complete unraveling of his deception, he still could not conceive of her wants beyond financial terms, still believed every problem could be solved through the careful application of money and leverage. I do not want your money, Eleanor said quietly. I want an admission. I want you to acknowledge, in front of Alistair and Charlotte as witnesses, exactly what you did 3 years ago, and exactly why you did it, not for any legal purpose, not for society's benefit, but because I deserve to hear you say it plainly, after 3 years of living with the lie you constructed. Lord Whitmore stared at his daughter for a long moment, something shifting behind his cold, calculating expression, perhaps the first genuine flicker of shame Eleanor had witnessed from him in her entire life. Yes, he said finally, the word costing him visible effort. I intercepted your correspondence with the Duke. I destroyed his letters and altered your own, until the connection between you withered sufficiently to allow the arrangement with Gareth Ashford to proceed without complication. I did this because his family's debt settlement offered the fastest resolution to a financial crisis threatening to destroy everything I had built for this family, including your own future security. The admission, spoken finally aloud in his own voice, landed with a strange combination of vindication and lingering grief. Eleanor had known the truth already, had gathered enough evidence to be certain beyond any reasonable doubt, and yet hearing her father finally confess it directly still struck her with unexpected force. Thank you, she said quietly, for finally telling the truth, however long it took you to summon the courage for it. What happens now? Her father asked, his composure finally cracking to reveal something closer to genuine uncertainty beneath it. "Do you intend to expose me publicly, ruin whatever remains of this family's standing along with my own reputation?" Eleanor considered the question carefully, aware that whatever she decided in this moment would shape not only her father's future, but her own path forward as well. Revenge, however satisfying it might feel in this immediate moment, would not undo the 3 years already lost, would not restore whatever trust had existed between them before his manipulation came to light. "No," she said finally. "I do not intend to make this public, provided you release me entirely from any obligation toward Gareth Ashford, and provided you never again attempt to control my choices or interfere in my life going forward. I am not doing this out of forgiveness, Father. I am doing it because I no longer wish to spend my energy on anger toward you. I would rather spend it building a life you no longer have any power over." Her father's expression remained guarded, though something like relief flickered briefly across his features at the prospect of avoiding public scandal. "And Ashford, he will not accept this quietly, given the humiliation already caused by your flight from the chapel. Ashford's debts are your concern, not mine," Eleanor said. "You created that particular entanglement, Father. You may resolve it however you see fit, without further involving me in the process." She turned to leave, Alistair and Charlotte falling into step beside her, but paused at the doorway of the study, looking back at the man who had shaped so much of her life through careful, calculated deception. "I hope, someday, you understand what you actually lost through all of this," she said quietly. "Not simply the debt you managed to settle, or the scandal you are attempting to avoid. You lost the chance to actually know your own daughter, to earn her genuine trust and affection rather than her careful, guarded obedience. That loss, Father, is entirely your own doing, and no amount of financial security will ever repair it." Eleanor left the study without waiting for a response, walking swiftly through the grand entrance hall, and had nearly reached the front doors when they burst open from the outside, revealing Gareth Ashford himself, his face flushed with anger and travel, clearly having ridden hard the moment word reached him of Eleanor's return to the estate. "There you are," he said, his voice carrying the same cold edge Eleanor remembered from countless private moments before the wedding, moments no one else had ever witnessed. 5 days you have made me a laughingstock across the entire county, and now you simply stroll back into your father's house as though nothing at all has happened." "I did not come back for you, Gareth," Eleanor said, standing her ground despite the familiar flare of fear his tone still triggered in her chest. "I came to settle matters with my father, matters that no longer concern you." Gareth's eyes narrowed, moving from Eleanor to Alistair standing protectively at her side, understanding dawning visibly across his features. "So this is the man responsible for your little disappearing act. I should have suspected as much. Everyone always said you carried some foolish attachment from years past, though I confess I never imagined you foolish enough to actually act upon it. What I do now is no longer any concern of yours," Eleanor said. "The engagement is ended, Gareth. Whatever arrangement existed between you and my father regarding debts and settlements, you will need to resolve directly with him. I will not be part of it any longer." "You think it is so simple," Gareth said, stepping closer, his voice dropping into something that carried an unmistakable threat despite the calm words. "Do you have any notion what humiliation I have suffered because of your childish rebellion? I had already informed half the gentlemen at my club of our upcoming marriage, had already made certain financial arrangements contingent upon the settlement your father promised. You do not simply walk away from such commitments without consequence, Eleanor." Alistair moved slightly, positioning himself more fully between Eleanor and Gareth, his expression hardening into something Eleanor had not yet witnessed from him, a controlled but unmistakable warning. "The lady has made her wishes clear, Ashford. I suggest you direct whatever grievances you carry toward her father, who arranged this entire transaction, rather than toward Eleanor herself, who was never given any genuine choice in the matter to begin with." Gareth's gaze flicked toward Alistair with open contempt. "And what business is this of yours, your grace? Come to rescue the damsel from a fate you believe beneath her, only to claim her for yourself instead. How very convenient that your own fortunes recovered just in time to make such gallantry financially practical." "My fortunes have nothing to do with my presence here," Alistair said evenly, though Eleanor could sense the effort it cost him to maintain such composure. "I am here because Eleanor asked for my support, and because I have watched enough of your conduct these past days to understand precisely why she fled that chapel, rather than bind herself to you for the remainder of her life." Gareth's face darkened further, his hand tightening into a fist at his side, though he made no move to act upon whatever violent impulse flickered behind his furious expression. Eleanor felt her own heart pounding, fear and resolve warring within her chest as she watched the confrontation threaten to escalate beyond words. "Enough," Eleanor said firmly, stepping forward despite Alistair's protective stance. "This ends now, Gareth. I am not property to be fought over between two men, regardless of how either of you wishes to frame this situation. I have made my choice, and it does not include you, regardless of whatever arrangements existed between yourself and my father, before either of us had any say in the matter." Gareth stared at her for a long moment, something flickering behind his anger that might have been genuine hurt, though Eleanor suspected it was wounded pride rather than any deeper affection motivating his fury. Whatever he had felt toward her, if anything at all beyond convenient advantage, had never once resembled the genuine care she had witnessed from Alistair these past 5 days. "You will regret this," Gareth said finally, his voice quieter now but no less venomous. "Whatever fantasy you believe you are building with this Duke, society will not forget so easily that you humiliated me publicly, that you chose scandal over duty. You will find doors closed to you that once stood open, Eleanor, regardless of whatever title you might eventually claim through him." "Perhaps," Eleanor said steadily, "but I would rather face closed doors with honesty than walk through open ones built entirely on lies and quiet suffering. I have already lived that life for 3 years, Gareth. I have no wish to continue it simply to preserve appearances that never once served my actual happiness." Gareth held her gaze a moment longer, then turned abruptly and stormed past them into the house, presumably to seek out Lord Whitmore and demand whatever explanation or compensation he believed himself owed. Eleanor watched him go, feeling the tension slowly drain from her shoulders as the immediate confrontation passed without further incident. "Are you well?" Alistair asked quietly, turning to study her face with visible concern. "I am," Eleanor said, and found the answer surprisingly true. "Frightened, still, and uncertain about a great many things ahead. But I am well, Alistair. Truly, for the first time in longer than I can remember." Together they walked out through the grand entrance and down the front steps toward the waiting carriage, Charlotte falling into step beside them with a satisfied expression that suggested she had thoroughly enjoyed witnessing both confrontations unfold. Behind them, the Whitmore estate stood as it always had, grand and imposing, but Eleanor felt none of the familiar dread that had once accompanied every glance toward its stone walls. She left the study without waiting for a response, walking out through the grand entrance hall of the estate that had never truly felt like home, into the afternoon light, where a carriage waited to carry her toward whatever future she chose to build for herself, finally free of the lies that had shaped her entire adult life until this exact moment. The weeks following Eleanor's confrontation with her father brought a strange mixture of freedom and difficulty that she had not fully anticipated. Society, as Gareth had warned, did not forgive easily. Invitations that once arrived weekly slowed to a trickle. Whispered conversations followed her whenever she attended public gatherings, and more than one former friend crossed the street rather than acknowledge her directly. Charlotte remained steadfastly loyal throughout, accompanying Eleanor to whatever events she chose to attend, offering a sharp tongue and quicker wit against anyone bold enough to voice their judgments aloud. Alistair, too, stood beside her at every opportunity, his own standing within society apparently substantial enough to weather the association without significant damage to his reputation, though Eleanor worried privately about the cost he might eventually pay for his continued support of her. "You should not concern yourself with my reputation," Alistair told her one evening, as they walked together through the small garden behind his townhouse, the summer air finally warming after weeks of persistent rain. "I have weathered considerably worse than a bit of gossip these past 3 years, rebuilding an estate from near ruin. Whispered judgments about my choice of company hardly compare to that particular difficulty. Still," Eleanor said, "I worry that my presence in your life brings complications you did not ask for. Difficulties that existed for you before I ever fled that chapel and disrupted whatever peace you had managed to build for yourself." Alistair stopped walking and turned to face her fully, his gray eyes serious in the fading evening light. "Eleanor, you did not disrupt my peace. You restored something I believed I had lost entirely 3 years ago, when I convinced myself you had chosen another man over whatever connection existed between us. Whatever complications follow from your presence in my life, I welcome them without hesitation, because the alternative, a life without you in it at all, is a complication I have no wish to return to." Eleanor felt her heart swell with an emotion she had spent years teaching herself not to trust, the genuine, uncomplicated warmth of being truly wanted by someone who asked for nothing in return beyond her honest presence. She had spent so long believing herself a burden, a duty to be managed rather than a person to be cherished, that Alistair's simple declaration struck her with unexpected force. "I do not know how to properly thank you," she said, for everything you have done these past weeks, standing beside me through confrontations that were never truly yours to bear." "You do not need to thank me," Alistair said. "I am not doing this out of obligation, Eleanor. I am doing it because 3 years ago I lost the chance to fight for what I wanted, and I have spent every day since regretting that failure. I do not intend to make that same mistake twice, regardless of what society whispers about either of us in the process." They continued walking through the garden in comfortable silence, the last light of evening fading slowly into dusk, and Eleanor found herself thinking of how far she had traveled from the frightened, uncertain woman who had fled through a rainstorm only weeks before. She was still learning, still navigating the difficult reality of a world that judged her harshly for choosing honesty over convention, but she no longer carried the same crushing weight of powerlessness that had defined so much of her earlier life. News arrived a week later that shifted Eleanor's circumstances further still. Charlotte visited early one morning, her expression carrying obvious excitement she could barely contain as she settled into the small sitting room where Eleanor had taken to spending her mornings with correspondence and quiet reflection. "You will not believe what I have learned," Charlotte said, barely waiting for the tea to be poured before launching into her news. "Gareth Ashford has fled the city entirely, apparently to avoid creditors who learned of his failed arrangement with your father and grew considerably less patient about outstanding debts he owed them directly. It seems the collapse of his planned marriage revealed rather more about his own precarious finances than he ever intended to make public." Eleanor absorbed this news with a complicated mixture of relief and something almost like pity, though she could not summon much genuine sympathy for a man who had shown her so little kindness throughout their brief engagement. "And my father?" she asked. "What has become of him since our conversation?" Charlotte's expression turned more measured, quieter. "From what I understand, he has retreated largely from society these past weeks, likely attempting to manage whatever remains of his own financial difficulties without the settlement he expected from your marriage. I do not believe he has spoken publicly about the true circumstances of your broken engagement, which suggests he is honoring the arrangement you proposed, whatever his private feelings about the matter." Eleanor nodded slowly, feeling a strange, complicated peace settle over her at this news. She had not expected reconciliation with her father, had not even particularly wanted it given everything that had passed between them, but she found herself grateful, at least, that the confrontation had concluded without the public scandal that might have followed had he chosen a different path. Mrs. Fenwick, true to Eleanor's promise, had accepted a position within Alistair's household shortly after her testimony helped confirm the truth of Lord Whitmore's deception. She settled into her new role with quiet efficiency, and Eleanor found genuine comfort in her presence, a reminder of loyalty and courage in a world that had shown her considerably more manipulation than honesty throughout her young life. As summer deepened, Eleanor found herself settling into a rhythm entirely different from anything she had known before, spending her days between Charlotte's company, quiet correspondence with distant relations who had expressed cautious support despite the scandal, and increasingly frequent time with Alistair, whose courtship of her now proceeded with none of the secrecy or urgency that had characterized their earlier connection 3 years before. He called on her properly, with full transparency, taking her on carriage rides through the city parks and accompanying her to whatever smaller, more forgiving social gatherings still welcomed her presence. There was no rush between them now, no desperate stealing of moments before circumstances tore them apart again. They had both learned, through painful experience, the value of patience and honest communication, and they applied that lesson carefully to whatever was building steadily between them. One evening, several months after Eleanor had first fled through the rain into those familiar woods, Alistair invited her to dinner at his townhouse, a quiet, intimate affair with none of the grand pretension that usually accompanied such occasions among their social circle. Mrs. Bellwether had prepared a simple but excellent meal, and afterward, Alistair suggested a walk through the garden, much as they had done on countless evenings throughout the preceding months. The summer air was warm and fragrant with the scent of blooming flowers, and Eleanor found herself relaxed and content in a way that would have seemed impossible only months earlier, when her entire life had felt defined by fear and careful obedience rather than genuine choice. "I have been thinking," Alistair said as they walked slowly along the garden path, "about everything that has happened since that day in the storm, about how strange it is that fate, or circumstance, or perhaps simply your own courage, brought us back together in those particular woods on that particular day. I have thought of it often as well," Eleanor admitted. "How different my life might have been, had I simply said the word the priest asked of me, had I never found the strength to run." "I am grateful you found that strength," Alistair said, stopping beneath a small trellis heavy with climbing roses, the same variety, Eleanor realized with a start, that had grown near the old oak tree where they had first fallen in love 3 years before. I have carried regret for 3 years, Eleanor. Regret that I did not fight harder when your letters stopped arriving, that I accepted defeat too easily rather than seeking answers directly. I do not intend to carry any further regret where you are concerned. He reached into his coat and withdrew a small velvet box, and Eleanor felt her breath catch entirely as understanding dawned. I am not offering this out of any sense of obligation, or because society expects it, or because it would resolve the scandal still following both our names, Alistair said, opening the box to reveal a simple but elegant ring, nothing like the ostentatious jewel Gareth had once placed upon her finger, but something that felt, somehow, entirely more precious for its simplicity. I am offering this because I love you, Eleanor Whitmore. I loved you 3 years ago beneath that old oak tree, and I have loved you every day since, even through years when I believed that love entirely unreturned. I would be honored, more than I can properly express, if you would agree to be my wife. Eleanor felt tears gathering in her eyes, though these tears carried none of the grief and fear that had accompanied her flight through the rainstorm months before. These tears carried only joy, pure and uncomplicated, the genuine happiness of a woman who had finally, after years of careful obedience and quiet suffering, claimed a choice entirely her own. Yes, she said, the word emerging without hesitation, without the careful calculation that had once defined every major decision in her life. Yes, Alistair, I choose you, freely and completely, with no one else's voice dictating what I should want. He slipped the ring onto her finger, and Eleanor found herself laughing through her tears, a sound of genuine, unrestrained happiness. She had not allowed herself in longer than she could properly remember. Alistair pulled her close, and beneath the fragrant roses in the quiet summer garden, they shared a kiss that carried none of the desperate urgency of stolen moments beneath an old oak tree, but instead the settled, certain warmth of two people who had finally, after years of separation and pain, found their way back to exactly where they belonged. Rain had once brought them together in those dark woods, a storm that had seemed, at the time, like the ending of everything Eleanor had known. She understood now, standing in the warm summer garden with Alistair's ring on her finger and his arms around her, that the storm had not ended anything at all. It had simply washed away the lies that had kept them apart, revealing, beneath all that careful deception, the truth that had waited patiently for 3 long years to finally be claimed. News of the engagement spread quickly through the city, and though some corners of society still whispered judgment about the scandal that had preceded it, Eleanor found the response considerably warmer than she had anticipated. A duke's proposal carried weight even among the most judgmental circles, and gradually, invitations began arriving once more, doors that had briefly closed, slowly creaking open again, as curiosity about the romantic circumstances of their reunion overtook lingering disapproval about the manner of her broken engagement. Charlotte, predictably, took considerable satisfaction in the turn of events. I told you, she said, visiting the following morning to admire the ring and demand every detail of the proposal, that running from that chapel would prove the wisest decision you ever made, whatever the immediate consequences seemed at the time. You did not tell me any such thing, Eleanor said, laughing. You told me I was mad to consider it, and spent the following weeks worrying I had ruined myself entirely. Well, Charlotte said, entirely unbothered by the correction, I am choosing to remember it more favorably now that everything has resolved so happily. That is simply the privilege of a devoted friend, revising history slightly in service of a better story. Eleanor found herself laughing freely, a sound that had grown considerably more frequent in recent months, and thought of how strange it was that the very act society had condemned so harshly, her flight from that altar, had ultimately led her toward a life more honest and genuinely happy than anything the arranged marriage could have offered. Preparations for the wedding began in earnest as autumn approached, though Eleanor insisted on a far smaller, more intimate ceremony than the grand spectacle her father had originally arranged for her marriage to Gareth Ashford. She wanted no chapel full of strangers watching her recite vows she did not mean, no elaborate display designed to impress society, rather than celebrate genuine affection between two people who had fought hard for the chance to choose each other freely. Alistair agreed readily to her wishes, understanding perhaps better than anyone the value of a ceremony built on authentic connection rather than performative grandeur. They settled on a small gathering at his family's country estate, the same land bordering the Whitmore property where their story had first begun years before, with only the closest friends and family in attendance, including Charlotte, Mrs. Fenwick, and Mrs. Bellwether, all of whom had played crucial roles in bringing them back together. Eleanor's father was invited, though she extended the courtesy more out of a sense of unfinished obligation than genuine desire for his presence. He declined, sending instead a brief, formal letter expressing polite congratulations that carried no warmth Eleanor could detect, though she found she no longer expected warmth from him, no longer waited anxiously for approval that would never come freely. "Does it trouble you," Alistair asked one evening, as they reviewed the final wedding arrangements together, "that your father will not attend?" Eleanor considered the question honestly before answering. "I thought it might trouble me more than it does, but I have spent the past months building a life independent of his approval, understanding finally that his presence or absence changes nothing about my own worth or happiness. I would have welcomed genuine reconciliation, had he been capable of it. Since he is not, I find I can accept his absence without the grief I might once have felt." Alistair squeezed her hand gently. "You have grown remarkably wise about such matters, for someone who spent years believing her own choices mattered less than everyone else's expectations." "I had considerable motivation to learn quickly," Eleanor said, smiling. "Running through a rainstorm has a way of clarifying one's priorities rather efficiently." As the wedding day finally arrived, bright and clear after weeks of typical autumn rain, Eleanor found herself standing once more at the beginning of a ceremony that would determine the course of her entire future. But this time, waiting in the small chapel on Alistair's estate, dressed in a simple gown of her own choosing rather than one selected to impress distant relations, she felt none of the cold dread that had gripped her during that first, abandoned wedding months before. She walked down a much shorter aisle than the grand cathedral had offered, past faces that actually cared for her happiness rather than merely observing a transaction unfold, toward Alistair waiting at the altar with an expression of open, undisguised joy that mirrored whatever must have shown on her own face in that moment. When the priest asked whether she would take this man, Eleanor answered without hesitation, her voice clear and steady and entirely her own. No father's expectations pressing down upon her, no fear of consequence should she hesitate or refuse. She had already learned, through painful experience, the cost of silence in the face of a question that demanded honest answer. She would not make that same mistake twice. "I do," she said, and meant every word of it completely. Afterward, as the small gathering celebrated with quiet joy in the estate's garden, Eleanor found herself standing near the edge of the property, looking out toward the distant tree line where those same woods stretched into the horizon, the place where everything between herself and Alistair had first been rekindled after years of painful separation. Alistair joined her there, wrapping an arm around her waist as they both gazed toward the trees. "Do you ever think," he asked quietly, "about how different everything might have been, had I not been in those woods that particular day?" "I think about it sometimes," Eleanor admitted, "but I try not to dwell on it too long. We found our way back to each other eventually, through whatever combination of circumstance and courage brought us together again. That is enough for me, without needing to imagine all the other paths our lives might have taken instead." "A wise perspective," Alistair said, pressing a gentle kiss to her temple. "Though I confess I am endlessly grateful that fate or circumstance, or your own remarkable courage, led you running into those particular woods on that particular stormy afternoon." Eleanor smiled, leaning into his embrace, watching the last golden light of the autumn afternoon settle over the trees where her old life had ended, and her true one had finally begun. She was no longer the frightened bride who had fled through rain and mud, uncertain of everything except her own desperate need to escape a life not truly her own. She was, finally, entirely herself, chosen and choosing in equal measure, standing at the beginning of a future built on nothing but honest, hard-won truth. Spring arrived early the following year, warming the countryside around the Kingsley estate with a gentleness that felt fitting for the quiet life Eleanor had built in the months since her wedding. She had settled into her new role with a steadiness that surprised even herself, managing the household alongside Mrs. Fenwick and Mrs. Bellwether, who had become something like family in the absence of the one she had left behind, and spending long afternoons in the gardens she had slowly begun shaping according to her own preferences rather than tradition alone. Alistair's estate, once burdened by the debts he had inherited, had steadily improved under his careful management, and Eleanor found herself increasingly involved in decisions regarding tenant welfare and household finances, a partnership neither of them had anticipated, but both had come to value deeply. She had never imagined, during those years of quiet obedience under her father's roof, that a marriage could feel like genuine collaboration rather than simple duty. One morning in early spring, a letter arrived bearing her father's seal, the first correspondence she had received from him since their confrontation nearly a year before. Eleanor stared at the envelope for a long moment before opening it, uncertain what to expect after so much silence between them. The letter was brief, written in her father's familiar, precise hand, though the words themselves carried none of his usual cold formality. He wrote of financial difficulties that had worsened considerably since Gareth Ashford's debts went unpaid, and the scandal surrounding their broken engagement discouraged other advantageous connections he might otherwise have pursued. He did not ask for money directly, though the implication hung heavy beneath his careful phrasing. More than that, buried within the practical concerns, was something that read almost like genuine regret, an acknowledgement, however incomplete, that his choices 3 years earlier had cost him more than the debt he had originally sought to settle. Eleanor read the letter twice, then carried it to the small study where Alistair worked through the estate's morning correspondence, setting it before him without comment. He read it carefully, his expression thoughtful rather than immediately dismissive. "What do you wish to do?" he asked, setting the letter down and studying her face for guidance rather than offering his own opinion first, a habit she had come to treasure in the months of their marriage. Eleanor considered the question seriously. She thought of the woman she had been a year before, desperate and frightened, believing herself powerless against her father's calculations. She thought of everything she had built since then, the genuine happiness she had found through honesty rather than obedience, and the hard-won peace she had made with her father's absence from her new life. "I do not wish to restore our relationship as it once was," she said slowly. "That version of our connection was never honest to begin with, built on his control rather than any genuine affection between us. But I also do not wish to carry bitterness forward indefinitely. Perhaps there is a middle path, some small measure of civility, without pretending the past did not happen exactly as it did." "That seems a wise approach," Alistair said. "Whatever you decide, I will support you fully. This is your choice to make, not mine." Eleanor spent several days composing her reply, careful in her wording, offering neither forgiveness she did not yet feel, nor cruelty she had no wish to inflict. She acknowledged his difficulties without offering the financial assistance his letter had implied he hoped for, suggesting instead that his own choices, made freely and without her involvement, ought to guide whatever solutions he found for his current circumstances. She closed by noting, simply and without embellishment, that she wished him well, though she did not anticipate frequent correspondence between them going forward. It was not reconciliation, not truly, but it was closure, a clean ending to a chapter of her life she no longer needed to carry as an open wound. Life continued pleasantly in the months that followed. Charlotte visited often, her own courtship with a kind, unassuming gentleman from a neighboring county progressing steadily toward what Eleanor suspected would soon become another wedding among their close circle of friends. Mrs. Fenwick had settled fully into her role within the household, her quiet wisdom and unwavering loyalty a daily reminder of the courage it had taken to speak truth against considerable personal risk. On a warm afternoon in late spring, nearly a year to the day since Eleanor had fled through the storm into those familiar woods, she and Alistair walked together along the same path that had first reunited them, the old oak tree still standing at its center, weathered but strong, much like the connection it had witnessed take root years before. "Do you remember," Eleanor said, resting her hand against the tree's rough bark, "the very first conversation we had beneath this tree, all those years ago?" Alistair smiled, coming to stand beside her. "I remember every detail. You wore a blue dress and argued with me about whether swans truly mated for life, insisting the romantic notion was likely exaggerated by poets with more imagination than actual observation of nature." Eleanor laughed, the memory returning vividly now that he had named it. "And you insisted the poets were entirely correct, that some connections simply endured regardless of hardship or separation, however unlikely that seemed to a practical mind." "I believe I have been proven correct on that particular point," Alistair said, taking her hand gently in his own. "Perhaps," Eleanor said, smiling up at him, "though I suspect it required rather more effort and courage than any swan ever needed to demonstrate, given everything we both had to overcome to find our way back to each other." They stood together beneath the old oak tree for a long while, watching sunlight filter gently through new spring leaves, the same woods that had once witnessed a frightened, desperate young woman running from a life not her own, now bearing witness instead to the quiet, settled happiness of a marriage built entirely on honesty and hard-won trust. Eleanor thought of the storm that had brought them back together, the rain that had seemed, on that terrible day, like the ending of everything she had known. She understood now, standing peacefully in the warm spring sunlight with Alistair's hand in her own, that storms did not always destroy. Sometimes they simply cleared away everything false and unnecessary, revealing at last the truth that had been patiently waiting underneath all along. She was no longer defined by what her father had taken from her, by the years of manipulation and quiet suffering that had once shaped every choice available to her. She was defined instead by what she had claimed for herself, deliberately and courageously, in the aftermath of that storm. A genuine partnership built on truth, a family chosen rather than merely inherited, and a happiness that belonged entirely to her, earned through her own hard-won courage rather than granted by anyone else's permission. As they turned to walk back toward the estate, Alistair paused and looked at her with a curious, gentle expression she had come to recognize as the look he wore whenever he was working up the courage to share something important. "There is one more thing," he said. "Something I have been considering for some weeks now, though I wanted to be certain before I mentioned it to you." "You are worrying me slightly," Eleanor said, though she smiled as she said it, trusting him too completely by now to feel genuine alarm at his tone. "It is nothing worrying," he assured her. "I have been in correspondence with my solicitor about purchasing the parcel of land that borders these very woods, the section that once belonged to your father's estate, before his financial difficulties forced him to sell off portions of the property. I thought, if you were amenable to it, we might build something here, a small cottage perhaps, close enough to this old oak tree that we might visit it easily whenever we wished, a place entirely our own, separate from either of our family's history." Eleanor felt her eyes fill with unexpected tears, the kind that came now from happiness rather than grief, a sensation she was still growing accustomed to after years when tears had meant almost exclusively sorrow. "You would do that. Purchase land specifically because of what it meant to us, rather than for any practical advantage it might offer the estate." "I would do considerably more than that for you," Alistair said simply. "This land has already given us more than either of us ever expected from it. It seems fitting that we should claim a piece of it permanently, a place to return to whenever we wish to remember exactly how far we have both traveled to arrive at this particular happiness." "Yes," Eleanor said without hesitation. "I would love nothing more than that." They spent the walk back to the main house discussing possibilities for the small cottage, Eleanor's imagination already sketching gardens and rooms and quiet corners where they might spend peaceful afternoons away from the demands of managing a larger estate. It felt, in some small but significant way, like building something entirely new from the ashes of everything that had once threatened to keep them permanently apart. That evening, as they sat together near the fire in their own quiet sitting room, Eleanor found herself reflecting on the remarkable distance she had traveled since that terrible, liberating day when she had fled through the rain in her wedding dress, uncertain of everything except her own desperate need to escape a future that was never truly hers to begin with. She thought of Mrs. Fenwick's quiet courage in finally speaking the truth she had carried silently for years. She thought of Charlotte's unwavering loyalty, her sharp practical mind that had guided Eleanor toward the evidence she needed when raw emotion alone would not have been sufficient. She thought of her father, still distant, still carrying whatever private regret he might never fully express, and found she could hold that thought now without the sharp, bitter pain it once would have caused her. Mostly, though, she thought of Alistair, sitting quietly beside her with a book open in his lap, occasionally glancing up to catch her eye with the same warm, steady affection he had shown her from that very first reunion in the storm-soaked woods. She thought of how close she had come to never knowing this particular happiness, how easily her father's careful manipulation might have succeeded entirely, leaving her trapped in a marriage devoid of genuine affection, believing herself unworthy of anything better. But she had run. She had chosen, in that single desperate moment beneath the pouring rain, to trust her own instincts over years of careful obedience, and that choice had led her, through storm and confrontation and slow, patient rebuilding, to exactly the life she had once believed impossible for herself. The fire crackled softly in the quiet room, and Eleanor reached for Alistair's hand, content in a way she had never fully believed herself capable of feeling. Whatever challenges still waited in the years ahead, she faced them now with a steady, hard-won confidence, knowing that she had already survived the hardest storm of her life and emerged, finally, entirely and completely herself. The wind stirred gently through the oak's branches above them, carrying the scent of spring blossoms and new beginnings, and Eleanor found herself, finally and completely, at peace with everything the past year had asked of her. Whatever storms still waited somewhere ahead in the years to come, she faced them now not as a frightened girl fleeing a life imposed upon her, but as a woman fully in possession of her own choices, standing beside a partner who had fought as hard as she had to reclaim the love that circumstance and deception had once nearly stolen from them both.